Hello, students. It's time for another lecture. This is beginning to be a weekly thing. So hopefully there are some things that we'll talk about here today as it relates to our criminal justice system and the policies that influence a lot of that behavior, because those are going to be important things that we're going to have to address as social workers working with families and clients. So without any further ado, let's get busy. So first of all, let's talk about the criminal justice system, the need for it, and actually where it originates. So as long as there have been people living in communities, in countries, cities, states, the whole nine yards, all societies have developed a response to norm-defined behavior. So in other words, for people who stand to work outside of the confines of law, who engaged in all kinds of behavior that, if it was allowed to go unchecked, would literally lead to chaos for all of us on the planet. And so there have to be sanctions, or society puts sanctions in place to actually curtail, control, and to eliminate behaviors that are problematic to the overall good of society and its functioning. So where did this whole notion come from? So given that all societies have always done this, the American colonists basically just brought the traditional European thinking over as it relates to crime and control. So pretty much when folks got here to the United States, they built jails because recognizing that they were probably going to have some issues and opportunities to actually use them. But U.S. corrections kind of emerged in the 19th century when a business person, which I thought was really interesting, negotiated agreement with the court to supervise paraded criminals post bail, intending to report their rehabilitation efforts of the offenders. So, kind of the first parole probation pieces kind of started back then. And as we move on, and through the further development of our correction system, we saw that in the 1950s, we were still pretty much doing some barbaric stuff in terms of involuntary sterilization of people who were considered mentally defective. And often women and minorities of color were sterilized, often without their consent. So, as a means of controlling behavior. We've come a long ways, but we still got a long ways to go as it relates to that. As we think about criminal justice and the incarceration rates, Russia um, and the United States are pretty much neck and neck in terms of the rates of incarceration. So for every 100,000 people in the United States, 748 of them are in jail or under the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for the various states. So we lock up a lot of people. Russia follows us with 607 per 100,000, Cuba with 447, South Africa with 335. So again, the different laws, regulations in different countries calls for different types of penalties, but there are some countries, much like our own, that incarcerate people at a much greater rate than some of the other parts of the world. And that's an interesting phenomenon. Also, criminal justice is a costly venture. The average cost per year is about $22,000 to lock up when a juvenile individual, and only about $3,400 a year is used on education. As we know, education becomes an important and critical step in terms of helping people reorient their lives in a way where they can positively contribute to our society. But the dollars are just not invested there. 90% of the inmates are men, 66, over half of them are people of color. So there's some disproportionality and systemic issues around discretion or discrimination, should I say, for those communities of color. And about half of the inmates in are African American, while they only represent 13% of the population. So, statistically speaking, the numbers should be closer to the level of representation that you are in the community and not far exceeding that. And then you can start to look at the places in the United States where there are these larger rates of incorporation. So the darker the actual state in terms of color, and the more people they tend to incarcerate per 100,000. As you can see, Louisiana is the unfortunate winner. And then we've got youth incarceration rates as well. When you start to look at other countries, you can see that the United States is not doing a particularly good job in terms of working with that population as well. 1 in 10 juveniles are incarcerated with adults. So think about, an impressionable 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old who goes into a system that will potentially hurt them, abuse them, and teach them how to actually be better criminals. So when they do get out, there's a high propensity that they will return to the life that they once knew. The new Jim Crow, this whole notion that there's this undercaste system that's producing individuals who are permanently barred by law and custom from mainstream society. So, for example, there are certain offenses that people are involved in and serve time for, but they then are forbidden in many states to have the right to vote. They are forbidden from having certain types of jobs. It is absolutely legal for some employers to actually openly discriminate against people who have criminal records. So you create this system by which we incarcerate people, but then the longer term effects is that we strip them of some of their basic rights to actually lead a law abiding life by creating those particular barriers and making them legal. And then again, if you start to think about who is locked up at a greater rate, when you see here we've got African American males, then the propensity for them to be disenfranchised by our system continues to be there. So if they are fortunate enough to pay taxes, they often still can't vote for the candidate of their choice, which just makes not a whole lot of sense. Um, in spite of the fact that there's clear research that the longer children are institutionalized, the more likely they are to become adult offenders. So it would suggest to me that there are some alternatives, maybe through policy, that can look at different alternatives in terms of how we deal with that youthful offender crowd. Other things that compounded the issue was the war on drug that started in the 80s that increased the penalties for drug sales and possession. Um, the idea to erase the supply and to use treatment centers, but it disproportionately impacted communities of color. So right here in our own state of Minnesota, there was a law statute as it relates to crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, and the penalties were much more severe for those who were caught using and dealing crack cocaine as opposed to those who were using powder cocaine, which tended to happen in the suburbs and oftentimes involved majority communities. So again, just little things like that in terms of the war on drugs and how it has this disproportionate impact for communities of colors. And then to take it a step further for those people who are currently incarcerated around the country as it relates to the sale of marijuana, let's say, and now that it's a legal substance in some states, what's going to happen with those people? Should they be released from prison? Given that now the states that they reside in or doing their time in actually now support legalizing the use and sale of these products. So again, some complicated things that we've got to think about here. Virginia, which was surprising, spends about 70 grand a year to incarcerate a juvenile, and again, still only contributing pittance to that particular child's education, which we know is going to be key. Um, so when we think about things like legalizing of drugs and how that could have an impact of lowering the prison population or increasing it, depending on where you are. And then we have this other notion in criminal justice of police violence, and it's resulted in the death and injury of a disproportionate number of people of color. And we don't have to go very far to even think back in our own state here fairly recently that we have had the George Floyd incident, which gained global attention as it relates to police violence. And those particular trials continue to this particular date. Also, cities are having to be responsible for multi-million-dollar lawsuits and paying of those. And then there's a fairly low percentage of law enforcement officers who are arrested and prosecuted for these crimes. So again, with the immunity that they have in some particular instances. And so as you can see here, just looking even back here in Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown was shot and killed by police officers. And when you start to look at the numbers in terms of people who were being pulled over, you can see the disparity in terms of the number of people who were black and what happened with them after that particular incident, and as opposed to the number of people who were white. So again, there's some issues in terms of our system that continue to exacerbate the problems. We've also done some research to figure out that family functional therapy is an evidence-based um, technique that works with juveniles, and it reduces um, rearrest by 48%, almost half. And so, we should be thinking about, are we looking at investing in those types of opportunities, or are we continuing to go down the road that we are? And then we also have the expansion of the prison industrial complex, and so these new prisons are being built. It's based on the fact that laws are being passed that incarcerate repeat offenders, and restitution and the reinstitution, I guess, of the death penalty in some states. So again, and we have a system that we know is biased, that's broken in a lot of ways, and we're still executing people at an incredible rate. And then when you, of course, if there's a disproportionate number of people of color that are going into the prisons in the first place, the same would hold true for the number of people that are on death row, that are actually suffering the ultimate uh, punishment for their particular crime. So, just wanted to share with you for a moment the realities of our criminal justice system and the reform that is so direly needed across all of our systems. And so, that would also extend itself to the members of the courts, which are backlogged, and to how plea deals are made, and is there adequate legal representation for those? The system seems to be tilted in the direction of those who are much more wealthy, as they're able to afford attorneys who can get them out of situations much more easy, as well as sometimes we have even judges who are rogue, who will overturn decisions and reduce sentences just because they feel like it's the right thing to do. So again, a lot of work that we need to do, and so I hope that you have found out some interesting information about corrections, and think about, as a social worker, whether this is an area that you might want to go into in terms of doing some work to try to revamp that particular system. So thank you. Talk to you soon.